Okay. Okay. So this is Pushing Boundaries, a podcast about pioneering research, breakthrough discoveries, and unconventional ideas. I'm your host, Dr. Thomas Wierne. My guest today is Dr. Gerlinde Alexandra Metz, Tier 1 Board of Governors Research Chair, Professor of Neuroscience, and Senior Scholar at the Canadian Centre for Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Lethbridge. She received her Bachelor of Science, University of Gießen, Master of Science, same university, and PhD at ETH Zurich. Does ETH stand for university?
Yes, that's the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule. In German, that's the Technological Institute of Zurich.
So I take it then originally you're from Switzerland?
I'm actually originally from Germany.
From Germany, okay. And where in Germany?
I was born in the city of Kassel and did my undergraduate degree at the University of Gießen, which is about an hour away, an hour south of Kassel. Oh, Gießen is in between Kassel and Frankfurt most people know well because of its airport.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Yes, I'm. My wife and I, we are going to Italy in September, and we'll be flying Lufthansa from Toronto to Frankfurt, I believe. Yeah, either Frankfurt, I'm not sure, one or the other.
Those are very exciting plans.
It is.
Great.
So when did you come to Canada?
I came to Canada in 1999, so quite a few years ago now. Yes,
it's adding up. And what brought you to Canada?
So when I did my undergraduate degree and also my graduate school, I did my master's or diploma thesis at the time already in Zurich, and then my PhD in Zurich. So I've spent a few years there, and I got very interested in behavioral neuroscience. And it just so happened that at the University in Lethbridge, they were the leaders in behavioral neuroscience for studying movement performance and neurological disease models. And so out of all the places in the world, I ended up at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada.
That's amazing. And you have been there since 1999?
That's right. I had actually a time where I led a research group at the University of Jena, and later I also did a habilitation in medicine there. But I was always connected to the University of Lethbridge. And in the meantime, we founded here, my colleagues especially founded the Canadian Centre for Behavioral Neuroscience, which now is a group of 16 leaders in behavioral neuroscience, which is a very exciting place to work. And so I just so happened to stay here because for me, it was the right place to be.
Very good. So tell me, what is behavioral neuroscience?
So behavioral neuroscience really looks at, in my understanding, it's a really broad field in essence, but in my understanding, it refers to studying the biological underpinnings of behavior. And I was always interested in behavior. I observed animals and human behavior when I was a small child. I can remember that at the age of 4 or 5, I decided I wanted to work with animals and I wanted to study their behavior. And over my career, I had the great opportunity to work with chickens, with songbirds, with mice, with rats, with monkeys, with apes, including chimpanzees and gorillas and Siaman monkeys, and so many other species. And it's always been really fun. And to translate my science into clinical realities, I also have the pleasure now of working more with vulnerable human populations, which makes it feel very rewarding. So it's been a journey. And I'm really excited to have had this opportunity to work on so many different levels of behavioral neuroscience.
Well, I became aware of your work in 2014 when I read your paper, and it's a little long one, so I have it written down. It's called ancestral exposure to stress epigenetically programs preterm birth risk and adverse maternal and newborn outcomes. And in this paper, you reported on the pregnancies in 4 generations of rats. Do you still remember that paper?
Yes, that's one of the milestones along the work that we've done with animals, actually, in this case. So it helps us here to use animals because they have a shorter lifespan naturally, and they have a faster reproductive cycle than humans do, and they age within a smaller timeline. And so although I would like to understand the origins of ancestral stress and programming of our health trajectories much better in humans, it's very difficult to study this in humans and look at 5 generations of human individuals. So there's no lifetime to really do this research. And so in this case, we had to learn from work of a social species in animals, and rats are fantastic. I love working with them. And again, as you noticed, I really look at behavior. I really like to work with animals. That was what was my goal, my professional goal. And so I really love watching animals and just see how they respond.
So can you tell us what it was that you found in that particular study?
So this part of the study is part of a really large research program that we actually started in 2004. And I have a really wonderful colleague at the University of Alberta in Canada, David Olson, who came to meet with me, and we sat down, and he was really interested in preterm birth. And so, because I was interested in the effects of stress on health and on behavior, because it is such a major impact on our well-being, I thought this is really a relevant question to ask. And so when he asked me, David asked me about how can we look at the origins of preterm birth and what causes it, I said it's maybe related to stress, because stress impacts so many aspects of our behavior. And so I really go far back here in answering your question, because this is really how we started this long-term research program that now goes back almost 2 decades. And it led us into studying the transgenerational effects of stress, because at the time we observed that even mild psychological stress, something that we would experience in a lifetime, would not lead directly to preterm birth in our experimental setting. And this is also what we often observe in humans, that we have often no reasons why someone, by a mother, comes down with a preterm birth risk. And so we thought, well, maybe it's something that goes beyond a lifespan, a single lifetime. Maybe we have to look at experiences in previous lifetimes. And we came across the notion of the healthy migrant effect, which stated, and that came from the US actually, an observation that migrants tend to be healthier than the local population. And they also tend to be healthier than often their own offspring. And so obviously they were resilient in a way to make the decision or arrive at a different place to migrate. And you and I, we're also migrants. We can relate to this circumstance. It is a very stressful experience in some ways, but often it's also associated with resilience. And so we thought, okay, maybe we look at the offspring. And so we started breeding 5 generations of rats. And we looked at how the effect of ancestral stress is trickling down and leading to a biological imprint that we can still see 3 or 4 generations removed. And that was really stunning. And there actually we saw that stress was indeed linked to a higher risk of preterm birth. And then coming off from that, because I was interested in behavior. We looked at various mental health outcomes and various other biological underpinnings that would lead to altered health outcomes in our pregnant mothers. And so this led to the study that you're referring to, because we have looked at symptoms of depression and anxiety-like behaviors. We have looked at metabolic disease. We have looked at preterm birth, as I mentioned. We have looked at aging. We have looked at early developmental outcomes. So we had the opportunity to look at lifetime health outcomes, starting not only at the day of birth, but even before being born, prenatally, up to old age, across 5 generations. And we have repeated this multiple different times. And it was a really, really rewarding line of research that we're still working on right now in some ways. Although we have a broader research program than that, but we really got very intrigued by these effects that we saw across generations.
So, so geneticists, as you well know, for a long time had kind of a jaundiced view of epigenetics to start with, right? So, and then when you came out with your findings about the effects of stress go back more than 1 generation, in other words, 3 or 4, how was that received by your colleagues?
Well, fortunately, there's been a really great groundwork by several teams of colleagues before, especially focusing on nutrition in this case. So there's been the Dutch famine birth cohort led by Dr. Tessa Roosboom out of Amsterdam, and also the Overkalix study, which comes from Sweden. And these are studies that looked at transgenerational origins of health outcomes based on altered nutrition. So either having overnutrition or a severe reduction in calories, like it is in the Dutch famine birth cohort. So there's been observations. There are also cohorts like the Alsbach cohort in the UK that has actually looked at some of the epigenetic linkages to previous generations in some ways. So we had some indicators that this would also be potentially a phenomenon that we would see in human populations, to see transgenerational origins of disease, for example. So this became part of the wider world of developmental origins of health and disease, the DOHAT framework, where we look at how diseases, especially complex and chronic diseases, originate based on earlier experiences. And so we're going back not only a lifetime, but previous generations. And so finding the epigenetic underpinnings, and I can talk about that in a second, elaborating on that, initially wasn't very well perceived, and still there are people who doubt it, and they say epigenetics is a myth. I get these feedbacks in reviews of our grant applications, even these days. But the group of researchers understanding that epigenetics is a real phenomenon and actually explains a lot more of the phenotype in behavior and diseases and personality and our responses and our biology than what we thought would be genetics. Epigenetics really opens another world of how the environment interacts with our biology. And we actually realized that depending on the disease you're looking at, 70, 80, even 90% of the disease risk, even sometimes more than that, is caused by the environment, by experiences, and not genetics. That is really part of our genome, right? Genetics would be an inherited DNA sequence that somehow would be altered maybe, or would be adapted through evolution. This takes many generations to occur. Epigenetics allows us to do a fast forward evolution, because here we can adjust from one generation to the next So it allows us to survive better in an ever-changing dynamic environment. It's very important to have these quickly adapting responses to help our biology to adjust to something like poverty or food abundance, or going to fast food chain, or climate change even, or having certain other stressors in our world. So we can adjust to that even within our lifespan. So epigenetic processes are an ongoing interface between the outer world and our inner world and our biology, metabolism and behavior and brain function as a matter of that as well.
Very well put. Thank you. That's very clear, very well put. Now, I think in one of your latest papers, published in 2021, you published one with Dr. Hansi Hoover, Transgenerational Consequences of Perinatal Experiences, Programming of Health and Disease from Mother to Child and Subsequent Generations. So is that dealing already with people as opposed to rats, or is it still rats?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. This is a really good point. Hansi Hoover is a fantastic graduate student, PhD student in my team, and she actually does a lot of work with vulnerable human populations. She is a certified psychologist and counselor, and she worked with vulnerable children in the school division here in Lethbridge. And she took this experience into working with a group of Syrian refugees who came in 2015, 2016 to our city. And she was working with them to ask about their ancestral experiences and also their mental health and their concerns and experiences with coming to Canada. And so she actually translated this experience and these insights into the chapter that you're referring to. This chapter is actually part of a handbook of prenatal psychology that was co-edited by my colleague Rupert Linder. Dr. Rupert Linder is running a clinic for psychotherapy, psychosomatics, and gynecology in Pforzheim, in the area of Pforzheim. And we're working together, and we actually met through a conference that you organized in Berkeley in 2015, which has really led to another legacy human study, the Pforzheim study, which is so exciting to work together within this larger teamwork across countries, across disciplinary boundaries.
Yes. So you mentioned Syrian refugees. So they have been, we have the ongoing war, of course, in Ukraine, and there have been so many, similar persecutions and torture and killings of various groups throughout history, beginning, for example, with the Armenian killings. 1.5 million Armenians in 2017 were killed by the Turks, and so on and so on. Do you have any sort of insights into what are the long-term consequences of children born to men and women who survived that kind of persecution?
Yes, you're really raising a very, very critical question. Reading the news, listening to the news, and even being touched by so many individuals who had these experiences, and being a testament of that myself, because my own family went through experiences like these. I really relate to the news that we're hearing these days, and it's something that I hope that our research can help a little bit in understanding and raising awareness of issues and raising the call for support. So we definitely have as a biological neuroscientist here, from the biological perspective, I like to look at resilience and stress responses at an individual level. It just so happens that we all respond very differently to trauma and stress. And we have seen that in so many different groups of individuals that we've worked with, people displaced by war, people affected by trauma, people displaced by natural disasters such as flood or wildfires in various different countries. We have worked with groups like these around the world over the years. And we have always seen that people respond very individually differently to certain types of stress and trauma. And we are really intrigued by how some come up with an enormous degree of resilience and overcome these traumata, whereas some others have to deal with it for a lifetime, and even their children and grandchildren still catch some of this biological effect in some ways. So we try to understand the basis of this, because if we understand the stress response and if we see what really is resilience, personality-wise, behaviorally, but also biologically, what really is resilience, we don't understand very well at this time. But if we do, this would help us to create a framework how we can help others who are more vulnerable and susceptible to stress to also build more resilience. And what
do you have any insights at all? I mean, I know that it's still, an open book, but do you have some clues as to what makes a person more resilient than the next person?
So this is a really timely question. And it's really exciting that on that note that we have studied this for a number of years, and I have a fantastic team of students and trainees on board and colleagues, which I'm very grateful for, these long-term collaborations that we had. We have an idea that there are certain molecular factors which are potentially in some ways even linked to genetics, but also to epigenetic modifications of some of these molecular factors that can be, for example, growth factors in the brain. And this would help us to repair some of the stress-induced consequences in the brain much better if we had these factors on board. And so this helps us overcome the stress with a greater deal of neuroplasticity. So on that note, we've also learned that social support is very, very important. And we came to realize this now with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really presented a challenge to a lot of individuals, and not only vulnerable populations, but also all of us. Everyone had to come up with some solutions with financial risks or feeling isolated or working from home, you name it. There were so many challenges. Even access to medical health care support was very difficult for a lot of people. So we have seen the value of social support, and we've learned that actually there's the candlelight equivalent, the candlelight dinner equivalent to the stress response is something, a hormone we call oxytocin, which is a really cool phenomenon to study what leads to oxytocin expression in the brain that would affect our mental health. And oxytocin happens to be a neuropeptide, which is expressed when we have friends around us or family members, and we make contacts. So not only physical contacts, but looking at each other, interacting in a meaningful, positive relationship with someone, like probably we do now. We've got lots of oxytocin going on right now by having this conversation, and even people listening might, if they like our conversation, they might come up with a higher level of oxytocin, which then directly downregulates the stress response, which would be cortisol and other factors in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that we usually refer to as the stress axis in the body. So oxytocin, the function that it has on our body, are really one of the biological links we like to study more. We have seen in our laboratory studies that oxytocin can extend telomere length, which is a marker of biological aging. And this indicates that people who have meaningful friendships and family connections can actually live longer and stay happier for longer. And there are human observations to support this. And we have seen that what's interesting that actually, especially females respond especially readily to the effects of oxytocin as compared to males.
Isn't there more oxytocin in females to start with than in males?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the interesting points, because oxytocin, the females respond higher and more strongly to oxytocin. They have a higher level of receptors, and they have also more easily secrete oxytocin in response to a socially engaging event, which is really great to know for example, vulnerable pregnant mothers who felt very isolated during the pandemic, having a support network of some kind. However, this is possible under the circumstances of a pandemic and social distancing. I think a support network would really help anyone, and especially, for example, mothers during pregnancy or when they have small children. And so it's actually an evolutionary perspective why that happens. It's difficult to study in a causal way, but we have seen that there are suggestions that for females who are evolutionary, the ones who stick together with the family, make sure the kids are safe at home, and make sure when their husbands come home to have a homely environment in evolution. I don't want to really females in a bad spot here, because we love working and we love going out and leaving our home, but evolutionary, they were the ones to raise the family, to raise the children. And so they had a higher response to oxytocin naturally. The males were the ones looking at our Neanderthal ancestors to go hunting and also to go sometimes into war and defending their territories. And so for them, it wouldn't help to hug their enemies and have high levels of oxytocin in response to seeing another male out there. And so they actually have a different response. They do have oxytocin responses, but they have peaks at different times in their lives and different situations, different social situations. So it's a very interesting response. Like our stress response, this is something formed by our million years ago ancestors. That is really a Neanderthal response, how our oxytocin systems respond to social support, but also how our stress system responds to challenging situations. Again, that is a really old-fashioned response that sometimes is not very well adjusted to our modern day-to-day life that we're having right now.
So what about vasopressin, which is sort of the opposite to oxytocin and seems to be more prevalent in men? What role does that play? Vasopressin.
Yes, actually, this one has also a very different set of hormonal responses, and it is quite closely connected to physiological responses to stress and maintaining homeodynamic states in the body. And so I would say this also has actually a very important response to maintaining water and cardiovascular functions and kidney functions in the body. And so it has very different set points for our cardiovascular output and can modify different sets of physiological functions. So they actually are all orchestrated with our stress response and cortisol responses that we have in our system as well.
So going back to resilience, you said that social support is very important, correct?
That's right. So social support is something that we are very concerned about these days, especially. There is, to go back to the situation that you were describing with current challenges in the Ukraine war, and so many people being displaced. We have an ever larger refugee number. We never had so many people displaced in the world as we have these days. There is social support that we can provide. There should be a focus on social support more and more with what we can do for people who are challenged by these situations, or people who are challenged by multi-generational trauma, even challenged by ongoing poverty, or challenged by, like our indigenous populations, challenged by multi-generational trauma linked to residential school experiences. There is so much around us how we can support each other. And social support is definitely something that our brain is built directly to respond to. We're a social species. And having the contact is very important to maintain our mental and physical health. We talk about the psychosomatic aspect here. And so it's very important to maintain mental health, because that will help us to have a better physical health long-term as well. And so what we've learned from our studies, actually, that there are therapies that some of the population studies integrate. For example, we know from the Gomeroi-Gangal study that Dr. Kim Ray in Australia is doing. This is a very vulnerable population of indigenous individuals who suffered from multiple generations of maltreatment in their society. Right. And she is offering social support through culturally meaningful art, and also engaging the society together at different levels, different people, bringing them together for producing art. And this is a socially engaging event for them. And it seems to really help healing their wounds that they have. And they do this in a very systematic way. They bring together people from the general community with the indigenous population. They engage in a meaningful exchange, learn about their traditions, about the history. And it seems such an enriched environment to me that we can really relate to this, that this would be a very nice event to have for our community in Canada too, on a broader base perhaps. And we have seen that also social interactions, for example, within the Pforzheim study, psychotherapy, which is something that you've practiced a lot. This is also a social event where we have meaningful conversations and we open up and we share trust between two people. And this again can help heal past wounds in a great deal. So this again has been an experience where we've seen, and this is something that Dr. Linder did in his practice, that actually the rates of preterm birth, the rates of cesarean section and other adverse birth outcomes were significantly less common in mothers who had this kind of psychotherapeutic treatment during pregnancy and engaged in this meaningful social interaction within his practice. So we have a number of pieces of evidence that show us that meaningful social engagement can heal and maintain our mental health, but also grow it and help us build resilience and overcome past traumata. And that, going back to our ancestral stressors, is very important to realize, because we have seen also in our experimental work that at any time in life we can engage with meaningful experiences, social support, to overcome adverse experiences by our ancestors, because we're born into these situations. We cannot choose our ancestors. and we cannot really reverse their traumatic experiences. So we have them in us, and they're programmed. We call that programming by inheritance, inherited epigenetic signatures. But the thing is, they were programmed by adverse experiences, so we can also reverse them by positive beneficial experiences. And this we have documented in one of our studies, where we were able to see that by enriched environments with social support and a lot of meaningful physical, social, and sensory stimulations, actually our rats in the lab were becoming healthier, happier, and they were able to reverse any of these epigenetic signatures they had based on ancestral stress. And we were stunned by this effect, actually. I did not expect to see such a clear-cut response to enriched environments.
Okay, so that's very hopeful. But before we get to the therapy, before we get to helping the children, how are they born? Like, in what way will be the children, let's say, of the Ukrainian refugees who are fleeing, let's say, from Ukraine, who have been exposed to bombings and threats and God knows what kinds of abuse? How will these children, when they are born, before they have a chance to be treated, how will they be different from children born to mothers who were not exposed to those kinds of stresses? What is your prediction based sort of on all your research?
So also based on what I hear from colleagues is that
yes,
there was tremendous trauma, that people who were forced away from their homes, who were forced to flee their country and go into a new place and build a new life, that this is not only a short-term stress, this is a long-term experience for the entire family, for mothers and for fathers. And so preconception, this could actually have an impact on the future children, but also during pregnancy, these experiences are definitely something that will affect the children. And we can expect some consequences to see in the children, but also on the positive note, I think a lot of these biological mechanisms, just to give a glimpse of hope here, because as a human species, we are not doomed. We overcame so many adverse experiences in our history. And so over time, and again, going back to the Neanderthal type of evolution, since then, we have actually developed mechanisms that help us intrinsically to also cope with very severe stresses in our life. And there were many severe stresses in our history of everyone's family tree, I'm very sure. So there are mechanisms that could help us cope better and adapt to some of these experiences. So that's actually how all these mechanisms that I was talking about before were built. They were there to help us in the first instance, because if they were not helpful, we probably wouldn't be here anymore as a human species. So they were built there to help us adapt to some of these adverse experiences. So, for example, metabolism can easily adapt to certain changes in our eating habits and to stress as well. Stress is at the cellular level and a metabolic adjustment to deal with our energy needs. So this can be done easily with how our body responds, how our epigenetic markers respond, and how they help us to change our behavior, our metabolism, our cardiovascular and kidney function and digestive functions to our energy needs and current needs in lifestyle. So that being put, of course, if we experience long-term severe stress or repeated stress over and over again, and if the stress doesn't go away, it can lead to some changes in our bodies that might not be very helpful. So we might pay a price down the road. Maybe immediately we adapt to deal very well with this emergency situation. And we talk about fight or flight response, which is basically built for dealing with a short-term stressor. For long-term stress, we have these adaptive responses still going on and they help us. But if we have them and we challenge our body for a really long period of time, we might actually have to pay a price for this at some point. And so this is what I'm worried about mainly. And so I'm worried about that adults, but also children living in adverse environments pay a price in the long term. And that's what we have to learn. It's very difficult to do long-term health studies. We have human population studies. We have, even now, I know that some of my colleagues started to work with the Ukrainian community to help them and support them specifically, and also ask them questions about how they're feeling and how can we help you. Long-term studies, however, to follow up with individuals are very difficult to do. So most funding circles only support studies for 3 to 5, maybe 7 years. So these studies that we help build over time actually get lost when the money gets cut off, unfortunately. So in order to do systematic studies with questionnaires and keeping asking the same questions, like how do you feel today? What kind of health outcomes do you have? Are you happy right now? Or do you have concerns? Do you think you have enough social support? Do you think you get the support from your community? We have to ask these questions over and over and over again in order to understand long-term health outcomes very well within the context of the social environment and of the experiences that individuals have. And this is difficult to do.
I understand. I imagine you're familiar with Dr. Yehuda's studies in New York, the studies
That's right.
of the children of Holocaust survivors and survivors of 9/11. So I found those studies confusing. I thought that what she was saying, and perhaps you can throw some light on this, I thought that what she was saying was that the children were born with less of a response to stressful situations than normal, that in fact they were reacting less to stress. In other words, they would be more resilient. That somehow doesn't make sense to me.
Yes, you're raising a very important point. Thank you, Thomas, because this is something that is very difficult to understand. What you're mentioning, this is what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, which physiologically scientists like Dr. Yehuda have linked to a blunted stress response. And so initially, and I stated that actually the stress response is thought to be our friend. It's thought to help us deal with stress. So we actually have an increase in stress hormones in response to a stressful situation. Can be a psychological stressor, can be also seeing a bear in the forest. That would be our ancestors' response. And we have this emergency fight or flight response. We overcome the stressor, we retreat or we fight or we solve that stressful situation one way or another. And then we can deal with our basic physiological functions again, return back to normal, downregulate the stress response. So that means the cortisol levels that were really high initially in the emergency situation, they come down back to normal. So that's all great. That's what we're talking about on a normal day-to-day stress response. If we have chronic stressors, actually the body is challenged over and over again with this kind of response. And especially children that will actually respond to stress very readily, and even prenatally, their stress response will be shaped by the mother's stress. So the mother sends a message to the baby how stressful this environment is, and the baby's stress response during development in the womb will actually be shaped by that, because the stress response will adapt to the mother's environment in a way. So if there's a lot of stress, the baby will adjust in that way that at that time seems physiologically meaningful. The thing is that then the stress response gets programmed in a very different way than what we would have seen in the situation I just described with the fight or flight response, because now the child's stress response is programmed to a very high level of stress that is ongoing in the environment. So with normal day-to-day stressors, the stress response doesn't respond anymore in a normal way because it became desensitized. Mm. So there's an adaptation which we can see in terms of receptors in the brain for stress hormones. And Jonathan Sickel has described this really very well. He's at the University of Edinburgh, of how physiologically a stress response gets adapted early on to the levels of stress in our environment. So that could be a situation if a mother is exposed to something like 9/11, and this is a lingering stress for the mother because they got really severely disturbed by what was going on in their environment. Not even when they lived in New York, but we've seen that mothers who lived in, for example, the Netherlands, far away, they also had an enhanced stress response, and their children also had some of these consequences. So wherever we live in the world, we really respond to these adverse news and that we hear. And we live through these stressful events in our own way. So post-traumatic stress that happens later in a lifetime, that's different situation, because of course the stress response has been matured and someone again now encounters a very severe and severely, essentially disturbing trauma, and more than a stressful event. So a deep down trauma, like 9/11 for an adult living there in the area of New York, or someone going through the Holocaust, having fears for their life, also undernutrition or forced work, or being persecuted and fearing about their life for a longer period of time. The stressor doesn't go away and is there persistently. This, or even as a first responder, like a paramedic attending a very severe emergency situation where they have seen something they've never seen before, a soldier going to war, being forced to confront really very situations that are we never even can imagine seeing them in our lifetime. This leads to moral injury, which really is a deep down, I would say, a wound, to a psychological wound that goes really deep down. This can lead to post-traumatic stress. And again, to the response you were describing of not having the appropriate stress response to overcome that stressor anymore. And so the stress response has been hurt and somehow wounded in such a fundamental way, it cannot mount a normal stress response anymore when we encounter the normal little types of stress comparatively in such a lifetime.
Would you say that children born to mothers and fathers who have gone through incredible stresses, traumas, are they more anxious, more depressed, or are they normal?
So post-traumatic stress and also long-term effects of chronic stress in any way can have a burden for our mental health. And so having chronic stress or ruminating about stressors we think are there or they are objectively there, and we get really entrapped in this situation that we experience a stress or perceive a stress over and over again or repeatedly, it can lead to long-term health outcomes. And that is what in our society we're really concerned about, to higher levels of anxiety and depression. And everyone deals with it in a very different way. Some seek help more easily, some might retreat from society and even not engage with the socially meaningful relationships anymore in response to some of these experiences. At the brain's level, we also see changes that can be really measured. So these are real consequences. It is not just in our mind, these are physiologically real consequences for our body. We see that receptor levels for stress hormones are being altered. We see that brain circuits get rewired. We see that hormonal levels change in various different ways within our body, and they affect the organ function in very different ways. And so these are real responses in our body. And I think this is what we have to take serious. We easily say, oh, I know, I feel stressed today and I feel depressed. But if this really happens and it really affects someone's behavior, it is connected to some real physical changes. And we need to find ways how we can easily identify who is at risk of these severe fundamental changes in overall health and well-being, and how we can predict who is at risk and how can we intervene and prevent these psychosomatic spin-off consequences, because this is then becoming fundamentally ingrained in our bodies. And I love your book, The Embodied Mind, because it is really talking about this, how the body and the brain are all connected together. And we see this over and over again in our research, that chronic stress can lead to altered kidney function, liver function, heart function. And when it is at that stage, it is actually harder to heal, because we need a more severe impact to really make it up for this long-term damage on the body. So my concern is with our research is really, how can we predict who's at risk? And this is why we set out with our research in the first place. We want to be able to predict and to say who's at risk, and then call out for help, because then we can have preventative means or interventions that would help these individuals to build resilience before maybe worse consequences are coming on board.
Sure. So as a psychiatrist, I'm always interested to know, you have done all this research, and of course it's very biologically oriented. So you talk about all the biological changes, the metabolic changes, the changes in the stress response. It's all biology. In your wide experience over these many years, have you come across any research or any personal contacts where actually not just biological messages, if you like, information was transferred from one generation to the next, but also some what might call psychological information was transferred? For example, the fear of water, just as an example, okay? Some kind of an anxiety which we cannot explain, but it makes sense in terms of looking back because your grandfather perhaps drowned or something of that nature, or was afraid of drowning. So has anything like that come across your table, so to speak?
Oh yes, I think anecdotally we can all relate to it, and I'm sure you in your practice have seen many cases like this, and it definitely is true that there is probably the unconscious transmission of information. And again, to go with the prenatal psychology side, this could be transmitted very early on, early prenatally or postnatally through behavior by our parents, maybe something non-verbally that was transmitted. We learn, and this is a cultural ingrainment, we learn also certain responses, how we should behave in a certain environment. And if our parents teach us some of those based on their own experiences or their experiences that they have learned from their parents or grandparents, then this might be something real, and it can become actually even something that is so deeply ingrained in our mind that we cannot pinpoint where it's coming from often in the responses. But also there's a really great example what we've learned in terms of parental care. And that again is a transmission of behavior, which we actually have seen also in many, many studies, for example, by Michael Meany, a really great neuroscientist here in Canada, who studied how maternal behavior and maternal care is being transmitted from one generation to the next. However, again, he was then, after further digging, linked it to a biological connection again, because the licking and grooming by a mother, by a rat mother in this case, was linked to a certain epigenetic change at the receptor for the stress hormone corticosterone in rats. So he found a biological linkage here. And I'm sure there are many others that would lead to this change in behavior too. So I think that the distinction is probably very subtle. Which kinds of experiences would lead to an embodied response and which wouldn't? And so I would say as soon as something is connected to an emotional content, maybe the fear of water in the case you described becomes so severe that we become stressed or worried when we see a body of water on when we are embarking on a journey with the ship. That can become stressful, and then actually maybe then lead to a biological response as well. So it's actually difficult to disentangle those two, the biological from the behavioral or mental psychological response entirely. I think it is a continuum there, a grayscale, and we still have to investigate further.
Yeah, we have to remember that everything is connected.
That's right. And that makes it challenging to study, but it also makes it fun to study because there's so much more to learn and our work will never end.
No. So what is your next work? You're going now on vacation, I believe. And after you come back, what's next for you?
Well, when I go on trips, and actually I'm going on a trip soon to visit my family, I actually keep working and I have collaboration.
Yes? Hello? You're frozen. What happened?
And so I think my mind never really stops. I think most scientists can relate to that, that we take the work with us. But in terms of what is next,
yes,
we really would like to break more ground in translating our research into meaningful interventions in communities where there's need. And this is really close to my heart. And it could be in many different ways at many different places. For example, to show how we can maybe provide support for the Ukrainians right now, or for indigenous populations, or for our children or mothers who are faced by uncertainty and stresses of different kinds right at these times of the pandemic, and fathers who are faced with financial burden. Whatever we look at, there's so much need. And the need is increasing because we have this uncertainty of when is a natural disaster going to hit. For example, in Canada, we see a lot of this, floods and wildfires and heat waves too. And so there is an increasing need to learn how we can build resilience and how to predict who's in need. And that's what we're trying to do with our biological markers. It's actually great to understand the biology underneath the stress responses and what's involved and how complex it is and how difficult it is to study. You answer one question, you have 100 new questions now. But on the other hand, it helps us to identify maybe signatures that can help us predict who is at risk. And we're looking at markers, for example, that are not painful to collect. For example, to pee in a cup, easily said, or to, give a little bit of saliva, or to even give us a strand of hair. So we can use these samples to look at markers and to see maybe if this person has a very different response to stress than what we would usually hope to see, and if this person is more vulnerable or at risk of long-term health problems. So that's what we're working on for the past years, and we would really like to take this a step further and apply it to clinical realities. So we're right now in conversations with partners who would team up with us on this, and to get out of the lab and get into the world and work with people who can help us apply this and use these markers. Also, we're trying to look at more of the organic response to what is happening in the brain in response to stress. And just what we were talking about, it's actually, we know about the gut-brain axis very well. It's received great attention, and it's fascinating to see how the brain can interact with the gut and how the gut can interact with the brain and with mental health. And we have the microbiome, which is 5 pounds of bacterial mass in our body that really influences our mental well-being and our physical well-being. We would like to apply this to other organs as well, because in our experiences, we have seen that there's the kidney and the heart and the liver and the spleen and so many parts of our body that interact with the brain along the same concept of ideas.
Okay, well, thank you. Time is running out, so I will have to just thank you for a wonderful conversation. You're doing such important work, and how it's going to be applied to people who are really suffering. And God knows there are too many of them around in the world, not just in Ukraine, but all over the world, unfortunately. So really, I mean, this is not just academic work that you're involved in. I mean, this is really helping people in the long run. And I would love to talk to you again, perhaps in 6 months or so, just to see how things are coming along. Would that be okay?
That would be fantastic. Thank you so very much, Thomas, for this kind invitation. It was such a pleasure to be here with you, talking with you. And thank you for giving me this opportunity, and also us on behalf of our team, our collaborators. I'm grateful to them, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to represent the work of this larger network.
I think you represented it just beautifully. May I just say that next week, my guest will be Mrs. Emmy Vadney, who is author of Intuitive Development: How to Trust Your Inner Knowledge for Guidance with Relationships, Health, and Spirituality. Hope you can tune in. And Dr. Metz, have a wonderful vacation. You certainly deserve it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Have a great summer, Thomas, and all the best to you. Thank you for this
all the best to
really
you.
Great conversation.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.